Well, thank you very much for that very flattering introduction. I remember, again, somebody David will know, a guy called Ken O'Neill, after being given a very flattering introduction by somebody, and he got up here and said, "Gosh, I can't wait to hear myself speak." So I think I feel in the same category. That was very nice, thank you. My links to Canada go back to 1984, my first sabbatical. At that time, the Canadian government was very keen to promote the teaching of Canadian studies. Well, except in the UK, I guess elsewhere. So they funded little scholarships for people who would teach about Canada, and gave them an airfare and a little bit of accommodation money to go to Canada, collect teaching material, and then come back and teach. So I was able to avail myself of several of these grants over the years. I think it was like one of the cutback. It got cut back by Harper a few years ago. I think it's just very short-sighted, because I know I always spent. Not only did I spend the money that I received in Canada, but an awful lot more as well. So I think from an economic development point of view, it was bringing money into Canada and hopefully enthusing students to want to visit Canada. So it's a shame that scheme finished. But anyways, on one of these trips in 1989, I first came to Sydney. I had the pleasure of meeting Harvey Johnson, Greg McLeod, Rankin McSween, and learned all about this thing called community economic development. And it had a fundamental impact on my subsequent thinking about how to deal with problems of uneven development, how to deal with what Harvey Johnson calls depleted community. So this visit in 1989 was absolutely formative. So I'm delighted it's not my first visit back since then, but I'm delighted to be here and actually to have a chat with Rankin yesterday. Very flattered he remembered me. It's not the best context to give a talk, but over lunch. But anyway, I'll do my best. How do we get this going? Right. I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit off the mainstream of community economic development, but it's still about venture capital. And perhaps, if anything, it's an argument I'm going to make why we need to see community economic development as a valuable, as an essential economic development tool, and perhaps again helps to justify initiatives like the one we heard about in the finance stream, the Nova Scotia impact scheme. Okay. We know that. We know that capitalism produces uneven economic development. Capitalism invests in places, produces booms, exploits these areas, and then moves on to other places and leaves former places undeveloped, leaving these very often peripheral regions and economies with the challenge of creating new jobs to replace the jobs that have gone away. The policy thrust throughout much of the Western world in the last 30 years has been on small to medium enterprise, particularly small enterprise, particularly encouraging people to start up businesses. There's an American professor, Scott Shane, who's come out recently to be very critical of this approach, with some nice quotes. There's a lot of evidence that these policies lead people to start marginal businesses that are likely to fail, have little economic impact, and generate little employment. And he wrote a paper with the title, "Encouraging More People to Become Entrepreneurs is Bad Public Policy." So he was very much one who advocating that we need to rethink enterprise policy to move it away from just encouraging people to start businesses. Over the last 10 years or so, even maybe less than that, evidence is emerging that most jobs are created by really just a very small proportion of the SME community. These businesses are assumed to be technology firms. They're assumed, if they're growing, to need finance. Hence, almost a kind of knee-jerk reaction of governments in developed worlds is to say, our first response to the need to create jobs is to create venture capital. But because venture capital is highly geographically concentrated, I think in the UK, something like 60% of venture capital is invested in London and the southeast. In Canada, it's probably in Canada, venture capital is very much concentrated in the Toronto area and to some extent in British Columbia. So peripheral regions simply don't have this kind of finance that is very much associated with funding businesses that are going to grow, that are patent rich, that are IP rich, are technology in the vanguard. So a major approach in local and regional economic development has been to create government-sponsored venture capital funds or public sector venture capital funds. However, there's growing evidence to show that these funds have actually been very unsuccessful in generating high-growth firms in peripheral regions. They're costing the taxpayer money. They're not boosting economic development. So what I want to look at is why should this be? Why have government-sponsored venture capital funds failed? I think I've got about 6 or 7 reasons, and I've got too much on my slides, so I'll praise you the slides. Firstly, these policies are exclusively supply side. The assumption is that businesses are out there, starved of finance, and if they can get access to finance, they will fly. That's simply an invalid assumption. In peripheral regions, there are simply not enough businesses that can put venture capital to good use and can deliver the sort of returns that venture capital, even government venture capital policies expect. Moreover, it's based on a false assumption that finance is the biggest funding obstacle to growth. One study by Nesta, the think tank in the UK, found that only 5% of firms listed finance as a biggest obstacle to growth. Moreover, not all entrepreneurs, even ambitious entrepreneurs, necessarily want to raise external finance or want to raise venture capital, whereas they see it, they're giving away part ownership of their company. Many fast-growing companies, many successful companies have actually grown on the basis of bootstrapping their companies. Moreover, the way that technology has changed is much less costly to start a business, particularly a technology business. I've read American technology entrepreneurs who were around in the 1990s saying, well, in those days it would have cost us $5 million to start a tech company. Now we can access all the technology we need maybe for a couple of $100,000. The cost of technology has come down. There's technology in the cloud and so on. You've got the internet to reach customers, you've got PayPal and so on. It just costs an awful lot less to start a technology business than it did 20 years ago in the heyday of venture capital in the 1990s. So a study I was involved in, looking at public sector venture capital, concluded that there simply wasn't a vast number of companies with untapped growth who would benefit from venture capital. When we compared the growth of companies that received government venture capital with those who hadn't, there was really no statistical difference in their growth trajectories. So, because of this, I think there's a real danger that government-sponsored venture capital will see the prerogative is to get the money out the door. That's really how these funds are judged, by how much they invest, not in terms of what their investment generates. So the danger is they'll invest in inappropriate businesses. So the first reason why government venture capital has failed is lack of demand, or lack of attention to demand-side policies. A second point is a kind of variation on this, that there may be some businesses out there who would benefit from venture capital, but they're not investment ready. They need to be kind of kicked into shape in order to receive and benefit from venture capital. Yet, there's a lot of programs that purport to offer investment readiness training, but they tend to be inappropriate and not really doing the sort of things that they need to do to make companies ready for venture capital. So, if government-sponsored venture capital funds need to develop their own investment readiness programs. I was hearing some Scottish businesses that had gone over to the States for some investment readiness training at MIT. And the thing that they said that struck them about the American approach was very much this tough love approach, which they felt was missing in the equivalent courses in the UK, where there was love but no toughness associated with it. A third reason, I think, why government-sponsored venture capital doesn't work is their investment focus is inappropriate. And this has a number of dimensions. Firstly, public sector venture capital tends to focus on small investments, less than £1 million, less than $1 million, or even lower than that. That's where the perceived funding gaps are. But in actual fact, I think the under $1 million funding is quite well served, not least by business angels. And certainly in the last few years, the funding gap has been beyond $1 million, the kind of $2 to $5 million, as venture capital firms have moved towards bigger and later stage deals. We certainly find this in the UK, that business angels investing in groups can quite happily put together a $500,000 or even up to $1 million investment. But then if the company is more than that, or if the company needs a follow-on investment, that's where the funding difficulties really begin to kick in. So I think the size of funding is wrong. Secondly, the preoccupation of government venture capital funds on technology, on funding R&D based companies, on funding university spin-outs. And again, I think that's mistaken. There's no evidence, in fact the evidence is to the contrary, that fast-growing firms are disproportionately concentrated in technology sectors. All the research suggests that fast-growing firms are not anymore disproportionately concentrated in technology, and actually a lot of fast-growing firms are found in very mundane sectors. Work I did in Scotland a few years ago on high-growth firms. I think the fastest-growing company was a travel agency, which is not something that would probably would be eligible for funding by a government venture capital fund. There's an excellent, Armar Bide, an excellent book came out a few years ago. He really made the point that attacking this misnomer that venture capital, private venture capital funds leading edge technology companies. And he made the point that they don't. I remember talking to a business angel in Scotland, and he said any scientist worth their salt in a university will be researching problems for 20 years ahead, not for problems of today or tomorrow. So if they try to spin out their technology, there wouldn't be a market. So Bide talks about how venture capital actually funds mid-level technology, not high-level technology that's kind of proven and on the verge of being adopted by the mass market. But government venture capital focuses on the kind of high-end technology, where, as I say, there isn't a market. And another misfocus is the idea of funding young companies. Again, in our Scottish work, we found about 20 or 30% of the fast-growing companies were actually management buyouts, or companies going through some form of ownership change. And again, in most cases, these sorts of companies would be ineligible for government venture capital because of the rules that they have to invest in new capital rather than buying out existing owners. So again, I think that's where government venture capital gets it wrong. Fourth reason is lack of connectivity. I think it's well recognised that in the early stages of venture capital investing, proximity is important. If you're local, you're more likely to find emerging businesses that might need venture capital. In the early stage of investing, you need to be close to your investee business because you're going to be actively involved in providing hands-on support for the business. But by the time a business needs second or third round funding, proximity between investor and business become much less significant. Indeed, it may actually be more important to have, if you're in Canada or if you're in the UK, actually to have a second or third round investor who's based in the US and can actually help you in expanding into the US market. So, again, I think for government venture capital to be effective, they need to develop partnerships with non-local venture capital funds that they can take their investee companies to at appropriate stages. But again, that's not the way that government venture capital tends to work. Fifth, of course, venture capital is known to be smart money. Venture capitalists don't just write a check and then come back 5 years later to see how the business is doing. They actually get involved in advising the company, networking the company, giving strategic help and so on. There's a question about the extent to which government venture capital is able to provide the same level of smartness that the private sector venture capitalists do. Indeed, there's research that actually kind of confirms this point, comparing companies that receive private venture capital and with companies that receive government venture capital, looked at the value added that's provided by each company, and shows, first of all, there's a difference in the type of value added that's provided, and that the value added that's provided by the public sector venture capitalists is much more designed to promote corporate growth. And again, that begs the question, well, the best talent obviously gravitates to private sector venture capital funds, where the rewards are so much better. Another point is a slight tangent, something I feel quite strongly about, is the whole venture capital model is built towards an exit, a harvest event. As you know, venture capital is patient money. The idea is you're investing for capital gain. You don't expect to get dividend income. Any profits are reinvested in the company. And what you hope is after 5-7 years' time, the company is going to be sufficiently successful either to do an IPO, to get a public listing in the stock market, or much more likely, will be an attractive acquisition by a big company, a Google, an Apple, or whatever. And that's increasingly becoming the case. IPOs are getting rarer and rarer. The question is this good for peripheral regions to see their best companies, the most entrepreneurial companies, being acquired by global companies? It's a moot point, and I don't think policymakers have really addressed that problem. To me, it seems the key is kind of the stage of the company when it's acquired. And in Scotland, we see lots of pretty small companies, maybe 2 or 3 million turnover, being acquired. So at that point, there's not really very much wealth being generated, not really very much learning being generated, being achieved by the entrepreneurs. It seems to me if venture capital is going to have a significant regional impact, it has to generate what's been variously called blockbusters or winners. Very big sales. I mean, I know there was a mega sale of a company called Radian 6 in New Brunswick a few years ago that was sold for about $300 million. I mean, that is just a tremendous exit. If you're getting even exits at $100 million, then there's wealth created that will hopefully be reinvested in the economy. The founders of Radian 6, I'm told, have invested in at least 30 new business startups. So you begin to get ecosystems developing. Moreover, if you've grown a company to that sort of size, the entrepreneurs will have significant entrepreneurial learning that they can apply in various capacities to new companies, going on the boards of directors of the company. I was involved with a PhD student in Scotland, where he was looking at technology companies and how they expand their top management team. And he found this was a major challenge because the labour market for people who have got experience of top-level management in entrepreneurial companies was very thin. Somebody coming from a big technology company didn't actually do an awful lot of good in a young business startup, and if anything, was probably a liability rather than being of value. So again, because of where the kind of the top-level management jobs are in an economy, they tend to be pretty much absent in peripheral regions. So not only do peripheral regions have a shortage of financial capital, they also have a shortage of human capital. So again, this is where funding successful blockbuster companies can kind of break into this vicious cycle and allow a recycling both of the investment returns and also of the human capital. That sadly, in most cases, doesn't happen, because in many cases the investors are pressurized to sell out early because of gaps in the funding escalator. The company might need another round of $2 million, but if that's not available, often the exit is forced. So it's a premature exit. And then finally, And more generally, one of the problems of peripheral regions is simply a weak entrepreneurial ecosystem. There isn't the support network to grow and support businesses. The Swedish economist Eliasson talked about competence blocks, the total infrastructure needed to kind of go from invention to innovation to entrepreneurial exploitation to growth and to exit. Probably Silicon Valley is about the only place in the world which has a naturally complete entrepreneurial ecosystem. Most places, the ecosystem is missing some of the key blocks, which very often is where government comes in to try and fill these blocks, not least in terms of venture capital. But if government comes in and says, okay, we're missing the finance competence block, let's create a public sector venture capital fund. But if there are some other competence blocks missing as well, then the efforts to invest in businesses are really unlikely to be successful. So that's my kind of take on kind of why government venture capital funds have not been successful. Hopefully there's some lessons here. Just to end it on a kind of more positive note, I did some work last year as part of a consultancy project for Northern Ireland, who were keen to develop their own government venture capital initiatives in Northern Ireland. And part of that consultancy project, we went around and looked at 6 regions or small economies around the world, all peripheral, to look at what they were doing in terms of developing public sector venture capital. One of the regions we looked at actually was Nova Scotia. So what I'm going to end on is kind of a positive note. The themes that kind of emerge from these studies, they're up on the board. Northeast England, Nova Scotia, Estonia, Finland, Republic of Ireland and New Zealand. All small, peripheral economies, 4 small countries, 2 regions. The first theme was that we found that governments were increasingly intervening at arm's length. Rather than setting up and managing the funds themselves, they were bringing in private sector fund managers to manage the fund, and requiring these fund managers also to skin in the game to kind of try and ensure that interests were aligned. So Build Ventures would be a good example of that. And NSBI pulling out of making venture capital investments. So that's one route that Nova Scotia is going down. A second is an international mindset, trying to develop pipelines to access venture capital in other regions. So again, Nova Scotia has looked to Toronto and into the USA, trying to showcase their best companies, these companies, having venture fairs and so on, to bring out of town or out of province venture capitalists. Of course, there's nothing like a few good exits to bring a region to the attention of outside investors. And again, the whole Nova Scotia, New Brunswick in particular, I know have had some about half a dozen really very, very good exits, which I think has made people realise that, hey, this is a region where you can grow successful businesses. So that's the second theme. A third theme is to say, hey, if we're going to provide finance, we've got to make sure there are businesses we can invest in. So there's a recognition that you can't just address the supply side without doing the demand side. So in all these countries, there's focused initiatives to develop the demand side. Again, to take a Nova Scotia example, Propel, ICT, mentoring schemes like Mentor Camp, Demo Camp, the entrepreneurial curricula offered by St Mary's, Dalhousie and Cape Breton University. New Brunswick University being awarded Canada's most entrepreneurial university, whether rightly or wrongly. I don't know enough to make a judgment on that, but clearly the universities are playing their part in trying to generate entrepreneurial students, which is exactly what it should be. And moreover, not just seeing the business faculty as being the only place where entrepreneurial students are. I can't remember who said it. There's an American guy who wrote in the book about startup communities in Boulder. He said that a business school is the worst place to put an entrepreneurial centre. A fourth theme is one of recognising that scale is important. So rather than having in this region 4 provincial government venture capital schemes. There's a recognition that there's a merit in doing at least some initiatives at a regional level. So there's been the creation of an Atlantic Canada-wide venture capital scheme. Similarly, Estonia is part of a wider Baltic region fund. So New Zealand is doing stuff on a wider scale. So the recognition that you need to think of geographical scale. What's the right geographical scale? And perhaps collaboration with your neighbours is actually will bring in benefits. The fifth theme is an exit-oriented approach to market development, a recognition that the name of the game is not to put money into companies, but the name of the game is to grow companies. So it's what these companies do with the money is actually what matters, and that's how venture capital companies should be judged. Unfortunately, media being media will criticise anything that government is involved in if there are investment failures, which is unfortunate. But we know that the part of the game of venture capital investing is that there'll be more losers than winners. So in a sense, the media needs to be educated that having one or two very successful companies is actually the name of the game, and inevitably there'll be some losses. So there's a recognition there, as I say, that the name of the game is to grow blockbuster companies, to get the recycling benefits when these companies are eventually sold. And then, sixthly, the penultimate point, there's a recognition that funding is an escalator. It's not a one-shot deal. We've got different verticals in the market for funding companies. We have seed capital, startup capital, growth capital. And the recognition, and the point is, there's no point investing just in one part of this vertical, because all you'll do is create problems further down the line. If you create a kind of startup fund, lots of companies being able to grow to the next stage. But if there's no capital at the next stage, most of these companies won't be able to grow. They'll fail. You've in a sense wasted all the funding you put in at the first round. I mean, this has been a problem that Nova Scotia has recognised. Where are we? The Build Ventures Fund assumed there would be demand for their vertical, but realised that actually there wasn't, because there wasn't the funding available earlier on. So Build Ventures have had to move back to make smaller investments in able to function. So that was an example where actually there's still a problem in this region. And then the final point is business angels are important. Given David's introduction, you'd expect me to work in business angels somewhere. And again, there's a recognition that actually business angels are the kind of key players in doing the seeding. They're the ones who are on the ground, will fund the startups, will kind of professionalise them, will prepare them for venture capital funding. I remember doing some research in Ottawa 10 years ago and asking the venture capitalists, where do you find your deals? And they said, we just follow the angels around, see what they're investing in, and then we will invest in some of these businesses in a few years' time. So having professionalised active business angel communities is actually a critical part of this whole entrepreneurial ecosystem, this whole funding escalator. Now, one of the challenges, given that mostly business angels are successful entrepreneurs, there is a kind of vicious circle in peripheral regions, which by definition don't have much entrepreneurial activity. You may have got a lot of high net worth individuals, but they're not necessarily made their money out of entrepreneurship. They may have made their money in non-technology sectors. So there's a kind of challenge of how do you tap into this high net worth money, which is really, I'd use the word pejorative, it's dumb money. How can you match this dumb money, or this passive money, probably a better term, with investors who can actually, the smart investors who can actually add value. So what we're seeing, and I mean Nova Scotia was quite ahead of the game in this with the first angel group, was that angels are recognising the value of joining together into angel groups, maybe by appointing a professional manager who can do some of the time-consuming tasks of screening opportunities. And you create a setup whereby the individual angels can decide whether or not to invest in any particular deal. But in any particular deal, you'll have experienced angels investing alongside less experienced or passive angels. So angel syndicates are actually very good for matching smart investors with passive money to get a leverage effect. And I think that's proving a fairly successful model around the world. So I think that's probably, actually, I think that slide's in the wrong order. So anyway, that's really what I'm going to say. So just to sum up then, government venture capital has proved to be ineffective really in generating successful entrepreneurship in peripheral regions. It's been doing the wrong things. It's in some ways not been doing enough. It's been taking too narrow, too blinkered a view. It's had inappropriate investment foci. Recognition, I think, now that public sector venture capital needs to be done differently. And as I say, we're seeing signs, not least on our doorstep in Nova Scotia, that public sector venture capital is now being done differently. But given the time scale of venture capital, it'll be a few years before we know whether this approach is any more successful than the approach that it's displacing. Thank you very much.